Hi, everyone. Welcome to our CAD Lunch Forum. I'm Leora Visotsky. I'm the staff managing director here at the center. The center is also run by a faculty board from across our programs. This year, our board is Fernando Lara, Miriam Solis, Nureya Feliz, Alex Yeshka, and Martin Hadish. One day, also, when we come back to campus, whenever that is, we will feed you lunch as part of this programming, so keep your sights on that day, one day. Lunch forums are really meant to be more informal presentations, opportunities for faculty and students to share collaborations, works in progress, research that they might want to receive feedback on. So in order to facilitate kind of a more discussion-like setting, our presenter is going to talk for about 45 minutes, after which we will open the floor to questions and discussion before we end at 1. So please, I encourage you to raise your hand, put a question or comment in the chat, and we'll go through them after the presentation portion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Charlton Lewis. Charlton is a senior lecturer and the Assistant Dean for Student Affairs and is a Margaret McDermott Centennial Teaching Fellow in Architecture. He has taught continuously at the University of Texas School of Architecture since 2006, primarily focusing on studio design and construction courses. He has also taught various seminar courses, including most recently Race and Gender by Design, which examines the relationship of design relative to narratives of race, gender, and diversity. Charlton earned his post-professional master's and Bachelor of Architecture from the UT School of Architecture. He has been associated in practice with the Austin firms of Dick Clark Architecture, Black and Verneuil Architects, Mel Lawrence Architects, and Barnes Gromadsky Kosarek Architects. He currently has a design practice principally focused on residential design and construction. Charlton also serves as co-chair of the school's Committee on Diversity and Equity and the university's Graduate Education Task Force. He is the faculty liaison for the SOA chapter of NOMAS, which is the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students, and a faculty representative for the Design Futures Public Interest Design Forum. Charlton was awarded the 2017-18 Faculty Award for Service by the UTSOA and the Outstanding Service Award in 2010. Charlton, thank you so much for joining us. Take it away.
Thank you, Leora. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you being here. And I hope there's not some residual noise coming through, and the air conditioning just kicked in. But I'm happy to be here. You know, in a way, and the dean just referenced this, there's some benefits to this remoteness that we're experiencing in this virtual, out of this virtual existence, out of necessity. And one of those benefits is the fact that we can have this forum, and I'm not completely freaked out being in Battle 101 with, albeit people tend to be nicely distracted by the sandwiches they might be consuming, but that's a little bit more of an intimidating setting. So I kind of like this virtual setting, even though Zoom has its own sort of technical issues to deal with at times. But I do appreciate the opportunity. And I like this forum because, and as Leora referenced, it's informal and it's about sharing thoughts and ideas. And when I was approached about having one of these forum opportunities, the first thought was, you know, what would I present? What would be the framing of this talk and this discussion and this opportunity to share with you guys? And I realized that I didn't want it to be sort of a quote unquote sort of like a one-liner where it's just a presentation of work or whatever. I really wanted to see, and you know, we're all struggling with a lot of uncertainty and stresses and things of that nature. And time, you know, time is very precious and it's fleeting. And my concern is that, you know, can I actually frame this discussion and this opportunity around something that is going to have some legs to it that'll enable me to carry forth in some form or fashion? Can I actually look at you know, something in my life that I want to deal with, that this is going to force me to deal with, having this opportunity and to put something out there, but also how is it going to benefit me in regards to my moving on with any number of possibilities in terms of whether it's academic or professional, whatever it might be. that in itself was a cause for some reflection. And this is something that we're going to hear a few times today in this discussion is the idea of reflection. And reflections is in the title, description. And the description, and when I was asked what the title was going to be, it was actually, it came to me pretty quickly. And it sort of, in essence, sort of gets at the heart of things because this idea of reflecting in terms of your own, and it was not planned this way, but coincidentally, there's some cross pollination with some of the things that are happening in and around the school, and in particular with Liz Ogbu's lecture the other day, when she referenced some specific points that I had picked up on in framing this conversation that I'm presenting today. And a lot of it just has to do with my own personal accountability, right? And I took several steps back and said, I want to, for myself, I want to chronicle in my mind the journey I've been on that hits on a number of aspects of my life, personal, academic times two or three, if you want to look at it that way, from being a student a couple of times over, being initially a fledgling lecturer, having developing a pedigree in terms of teaching and teaching pedagogy, but also now as an administrator as well. And so this journey has many facets, but there's some commonalities to it because in this journey that I've been on, there have been a number of opportunities and opportunities taken. And I think that's one of the things that I really want to, it's a personal conversation that I'm sharing, but it's something that I think at this point in time, in the uncertain times we all live in, I think we're all feeling sort of part of how personally we're being affected by the world around us and our take on the world around us. And this is my sort of sort of cathartic moment in a certain sense where I have been looking upon this journey I've been on, and a number of things have led me to take this on and to say the things that I have resonated with, the things that I've sort of let go in the course of this journey, the opportunities lost, it bears reflecting upon. And part of this also is driven by, just quite honestly, the fact that having a summer where health issues were prevalent, and there was a sense of dealing, in a very real way, your own mortality at times, and now on the backside of that, where the light is now past you. I'm very much on the road to recovery and maintenance, and feeling 200 times better than I did in June and July. But those times that were actually quite stressful and quite trying caused me to reflect on a number of things, but also to reflect on how my identity has been forged and how it has changed over time, and how I've been in denial about certain aspects of my identity. And so all of this sort of very fortuitously came together at a time in my life where I could sort of take this on and say, it's worth taking a journey back, because as a school in a community, we're struggling, and we're struggling with some of these issues that on an individual basis, but as a community as well. And as we are asking the community and asking ourselves, how do we move forward? I think it's incumbent upon us to also say, how do I reflect upon my individual journey, and how is that impacting my understanding of the world around me? And so that's sort of like the precursor for this, and you'll see a lot of comparison and contrast as I go through this talk. One thing I want to say up front is that because of, I felt that I've been detached from the world for a bit over the summer. And for those of you who I failed to reach out to or respond to, I want to apologize now while I have this forum, because it was a situation where, as you'll see, life gets complicated pretty fast. And now that you're through the worst of it, I'm feeling pretty good, but it's like you're realizing that you're never going to catch up on all the emails and all the reach outs and all the phone calls that you want to. But in one fell swoop now, I apologize for that, but also I kind of want to apologize for the fact that it's kind of hard to have a reflective conversation without it being about me. And so there's a whole lot of me in this conversation coming up. So hopefully some of it will be a bit of a comic relief. But it is really about a journey, and how our new normal, as we call it, is tasking us with this opportunity to say, what's my role, what is my identity in the world around me, and what's my impact, and what can my impact be in that regard. So as we move on, one of the things I'll talk a little bit more about this slide on the, I'm not sure if it's on your left, but there's only one slide, so you can figure that out. And I'm not sure what that facial expression is I have on my face. It's not anything to do with the project. It might have to do with the cold coffee in my hand. But there's an interesting sort of backstory behind this slide, and I'll touch on later on. But the text on the right is taken from what is currently nesting on our website, and it's part of the SOA Voices, where there's a link to various aspects and definitions and characterizations of diversity within the school. And there's each faculty member and student who's contributed to that SOA Voices monologue were asked a series of questions. And one of the questions that I was asked, and that you'll see, it says, can you describe the sense of community at the school? And I talk about here, what my sense of the community is and things of that nature. And it's funny because that was probably 3 years ago. And as part of this, putting together this presentation and just sort of stepping back and thinking about the roles I played and what I do differently, where has progress been measured and where has progress lacked, I look at this, and it's actually kind of hard to read. It's kind of hard to look at that link, and we're going to look at it later, but it's kind of hard to look at it. And you keep thinking, what would I say differently now? What have we done successfully? Is this too canned or not? Is it sincere? And it was sincere, but now I'm questioning sort of like to myself as the author, how's it coming across? How does it come across to me? And this becomes this very and sometimes painful introspection when you talk about these sort of issues and these sort of how you've dealt with things in the past. So it's a conversation I think we all share in. And the slide on the left where you see all the sticky notes is it's one of the artifacts from one of the town halls we've had, the code committee, which I'm co-chair of with Fernando Lara. We had a series of surveys in town halls, and this was sort of like coincided with both the town hall and a digital survey where we were asking students questions about their about the school, about the sense of community, about what can the School of Architecture do differently in regards to social justice and diversity and equity. And so students had the option of entering data digitally or in this case in analog fashion, and it was very animated in regards to both media, but it's particularly the opportunity just to walk by and put a sticky note and have a conversation about the school and the school's trajectory and what it meant to them individually. So that was several years ago, and you fast forward to this summer when I was approached by Architect Magazine through a third-party writer who was researching and going to do a follow-up article regarding diversity and equity in architectural education. And when the writer reached out to me, I couldn't really help myself because I was very curious as to, okay, why are you asking us? Because and they're also saying, okay, there's 3 or 4 schools that we're interviewing folks from, and you're one of them. And so naturally, you're sort of curious as to what's driving this. And they were struggling a bit to answer why why the path led them to us. But it turns out it was because of a Metropolis article and some other articles that came out a number of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe, that had to do with our race and gender initiative when it was introduced, and it was a fairly big news story. So it's hard to have this conversation with a writer when their angle is really about success and success stories. We quickly flip that to say, yes, that is a successful initiative. There have been some successes, but it's actually, you can't talk about the successes without talking about the fact that we have work to do and we have work to move forward on. And so the gist of the article hits upon points that are not going to be shocking or surprising to anyone here. We talked about diversifying the curriculum. We talked about how do we diversify our faculty, but also our student population, the community across the board. These issues that all pretty much every school of architecture is struggling with to some extent. That actually has gotten greater. Obviously, it's under a greater lens now, given the things that are impacting the world around us. So it wasn't going to be an article that was just going to be congratulatory in that regard, because there's real struggles ahead. And they have been there for a while, and quite frankly, and we all know that in that regard. But that article in that conversation also hit at a moment where this idea of being reflective coincided with that. The idea of saying what's going on. And it's not just about uh, what I touched upon, saying, okay, I really want to understand what my journey has been about, and what have I contributed to this conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Has it been challenging enough? Have I challenged myself enough? It became a common theme. Superimposed upon all of this is, of course, what's going on in the world around us. What it's been, and it's always been there, but it's of course been very highlighted in the last several months. And some of that was, even though it's always been there, it might have been easier to dismiss or just to say accept it as a normalcy. That became no longer possible this summer and this late spring. And we'll touch upon that as well, because what I will also talk about in regards to these various almost rhythmic reflections of the world around me and my identity and challenging my identity will also be times when very overt or subtle racism hit. Whether it's someone, and we're going to take a little bit of departure here to give you a little contextual background regarding my history, but growing up in deep Northeast Texas, at a time when it was, the racial engagements were quite a struggle and quite challenging. And even journeying from Austin back and forth to my hometown, or to the homestead, I'll call it. You'll see why I'm calling it that in a second. But to this day, that is something that some people don't appreciate what you have, the thought process of getting in a car and journeying to East Texas and saying to yourself, if I get pulled over, what will I do? When I get pulled over, where's my wallet going to be in this car to where I can keep my hands visible yet have access to the wallet and my license and registration, so I won't have to dig through a bag or anything else that gives anyone a reason to react. And that's something that's been ingrained in me from day one, right? And it's still there. That's still, and it's the fact that that's a reality is something that, well, I'll always live with, and it just comes second nature. But it's this brief journey back into East Texas and my history is necessary because it's a foregrounding of the struggle with identity. Because when you first have to see where I got transplanted from, and then understand sort of like how did my identity get impacted by living and being educated in Austin, and having Austin as being my primary residence for a vast number of years now. Maybe I should use the term vast number of years, but a large number of years, we'll say. And then it's again part of that comparison contrast. It's part of that reflection. This part of Texas is much beloved to me. It's about family. It's about my background is my home, so that's just literally out my front door and looking down the road. um, and you're growing up amongst pine trees. You're growing up where weather is something that you're very mindful of. You're mindful of nature. You're mindful of the dangers that are inherent in that context. But not just from predators and animals, wildlife, things of that nature. It's also because in less so now, I would argue, but back when I was growing up there, there was a tension. It's not quite as palpable. It's a different kind of tension now, but it's not as overt as it was. It's not as strictly us, them, that sort of thing. But and so in a lot of ways, it's improved quite significantly. But there's still some tension there, as there's tension in the world. But it was an idyllic place to grow up, and I constantly sort of wonder how I ended up where I am now from where that red dot is, which is that red dot is our home. And the reason I know that is because, well, now through the magic of Google Maps or whatever, it actually brings up an address. Whereas before, you would just have to sort of follow the roads and then see where the bend in the road was and look for the clearings. Because with all of this dense pine forest, the way you identify where home is look for the clearings. That's St. Paul Baptist Church. Let me go back one, sorry. That's St. Paul Baptist Church and the cemetery, where pretty much all of my relatives, historically, ancestors are are interned at this cemetery, and this is the church that I grew up in. Going back any further, I was to say this is the way to get to Austin. Austin's way down here. This is Cass County, uh, Atlanta, Texas. Atlanta High School is where I went to high school. Where I grew up is a little speck, a little dot where the cursor is now. And the one thing I'll point out is the first sort of thing that I'll share in regards to sort of like when did I really start understanding the ramifications of race in a bigger way was in this little town called Kildare at this crossroads. This is a crossroads that you go through, headed to my home, to and from my home, coming from to and from Austin. And in terms of racial progress, it was when the gas station that if you were a person of color, you knew that you could not get gas there, and up until probably maybe even late 80s, you probably couldn't get gas there because the name of the gas station and the little cafe that was there, if you want to call it that, was called Kilder's Cozy Kitchen, and it was all spelled with K's, and the K's were painted red. And that was the messaging that was telling people of color that you're not welcome there. And the fact that it was just a few miles from this, my home, was quite alarming. And the progress that was measured was when, before the place finally burned down or went out of business, or both, was that at some point they painted the K's black and all the letters were black. And that's the sort of sign of progress in a certain sense. What the determination was, and the rumor was amongst the people of color who predominantly inhabit this rural area of East Texas, was that was a outpost of the Klan, and you just knew that you weren't going to be popping in there for anything, much less gas in that regard. So that was a reality then, and this is the reality still currently, where very rural, quiet existence is a piece of land or land all through this, that it's not surprising that it's the land that was in its history is that it's the least valued land because it's the land that floods quite frequently. It has less value than the land around it, and land in any direction. So African Americans settled there predominantly, and they grew up as an African American community, a very rural farm community. A lot of relatives and distant cousins that populate in miles in either direction. Ironically, now it's actually being primarily occupied. It's a different kind of, the fact that it's hunting land, and now you see less people who look like me there driving up and down than it used to be when I grew up. And so right now my mother lives there by herself with relatives, third cousins and others that are fairly close by. And this is sort of what we get to see. It's very beautiful. I don't have a scale figure, but that's one big tree. I can tell you that right now, and amongst a lot of big trees, and a lot of wildlife. It's really a nice, laid-back way of life, but in a way, it's disappearing. It's disappearing because of the families, as they get older, they start selling the land off to people who want to come and hunt. There's a lot more sort of alcohol abuse going on. There are things that give you reason for pause. You worry about the land you do have. This is family. We did not get to have our family reunion this year because of COVID issues. And just about maybe a third of the people, these are the people who are the ones who are the big eaters who get there early. There's like 2/3 more coming. And then it's a family gathering once a year, a family reunion in that regard. And there's an obligatory mother shot. There's my aunt on the left, my mother on the right. So I want to make sure I give her credit, let her know she was part of this. And as we segue back to Austin, I also want to acknowledge that we're moving quickly into like my presence in Austin and jumping obviously generations. But when I was in school and I struggled and I actually took time off, one of the people who helped bring me back and helped me on the road to success was a good and dear friend who I miss terribly now, Larry Dahl, who this is a shot fairly shortly before he passed away, but he was integral to my being part of the school as a student and coming back as a returning student, and the success I've had afterwards, and the idea of teaching as an ambition. I think the photo on the right speaks for itself. Well, we'll take questions about that later. Well, I have several roles and I wear several hats here. And currently, I am the assistant dean for student affairs, but I also teach. And this is back in the day. The photo with the Mickey ears is back when I was just a whimsical student here, lurking around the halls of Goldsmith and Sutton. Um, and that's me on the right. I think that's Fritz on the left. And so we'll see. The teaching part of my existence here has been one that I've enjoyed thoroughly, and it preceded my administrative roles by a number of years. And for that, I have a number of people to thank who, what teaching was not an ambition of mine initially. Kevin Alter actually reached out to me about teaching as an adjunct, and lo and behold, I kept coming back. I kept coming back. Okay? And these guys are a large reason for that. This interaction with various studios over the course of years and years. So we've had some really great relationships, and we've had some really great challenges, and it's been a fruitful relationship across the board. This is again sort of a pause where I go after teaching for being here as a student, right, and over a number of years, and being here as an instructor. Uh, Race always was lingering in the background, and the struggle I had in terms of identity was twofold. One, coming from East Texas, very small town, a very rural existence, coming to Austin and getting pretty lost and feeling pretty lost and pretty disconnected. Not a whole lot of people who look like me, certainly not in the school, and for a number of reasons, it was a bit overwhelming. When I reapproached my education and felt much more confident about myself, there was also still this sort of question of identity that popped up in different ways and different challenges. I can say that as a one of those incidents, you want to call it that, was having being a student and walking on the drag, coming back with coffee and walking in front of their ransom center on Guadalupe and having a bottle thrown at me from a passing truck. Being sitting in a broad daylight at a restaurant, at a cafe outside on 24th Street, and having someone throw a cup of water or beverage on me while I'm sitting outside, right? As an African American, having someone challenge me because of my race, whether it's a street person or whomever, or sometimes more subtle in a way more insidious, where you're at a function or a game at a party or whatever, and you see people looking at you wondering why are you here, or who let you in, things of that nature. So it was just sort of varying waves and waves, and you end up becoming very defensive without knowing it. You end up sort of saying, one of your defensive reactions is sort of wanting to assimilate, wanting to sort of not completely disavow, but not acknowledge your own identity as a sort of a defensive mechanism in that regard. And I would also say, being repetitively being sort of, like, for lack of a better term, the only one. So whether you're one of the few people of color at the school at the time, and then you translate that to you're teaching, yet you're still one of the few people of color. What does that mean in that regard? That's a struggle in terms of, like, what's your role? What role do you play in all of those sort of spheres? From student, but what role do I play as a faculty member? What role do I play as an administrator in the University of Texas? And is it the same role that other people envision? Because that's part of the other quandary, is that there's an assumption at times that this is the role you want to play, or this is the role you should play, right? And that's something that has come up quite a bit in my life over the course of my existence as both a student, but also as a professional, but also as a academic as well in that regard. Opportunities like being the faculty liaison for NOMA's, the student chapter, gives you reason to engage students who are looking for more diversity and equity opportunities, and they are starved for that, quite frankly. And we, one of the initiatives we had was post Harvey, being able to go down and connect with the community in Houston and help them sort of do a day of service, and actually help them sort of rebuild and things of that nature, help them actually gut the damaged residences and their properties, and just be a small part of that conversation is great exposure, number one, to actually real people to find out their real struggles. And as a byproduct of that, also having a studio that was looking at engaging sort of real people and real struggles in communities that, particularly communities that are marginalized in that regard. So again, helping and being part of that, helping that process along was an opportunity to reconnect with identity in a certain sense. And I think that's what's important about this slide. It's just not just what the students were getting out of this, but also what I was getting out of it as a way of connecting with community. Another milestone in that sort of identity reflection was developing this seminar, which still exists, and was looking at the time when we were just, as a school, just starting to have the race and gender scholars started to be a part of the school, and we had other more welcoming opportunities to develop a more interesting, diverse curriculum. This seminar was one that got onboarded around that time, and it's developed, I think, nicely since. But it's one of the mechanisms in regards to allowing myself to actually start looking at more and more and understanding more and more this conversation about design relative to race and relative to gender. And it's been quite fruitful for me to look at these topics and also to interact with some of the race and gender fellows who have come along in those most recent years as part of that initiative. And so this, although it's been, on the one hand, what you teach has been rewarding and given opportunities to sort of actually deal with identity, the other part of this conversation is, in that timeline, is what is going on, what has been going on at the school simultaneous to that. So when I was a student here, there was absolutely nothing going on, except every so often there would be a faculty member who might be visiting, who was someone who was a person of color, or there might have been someone who was tenure track for a bit, but then they sort of mysteriously disappeared. And so you didn't really see much in regards to an overt, and this goes at the university level as well, an overt attempt to really tackle this conversation about representation, identity, diversity, equity on any level. And that's changed over the years, but it's obviously still a work in progress. What I was going to say about that particular slide was it sort of acknowledges that as this part of the school strategic planning efforts in regards to diversity and equity, which was one of the earliest ones in the university, was the one that the School of Architecture put forward. Part of that initiative was to develop the code committee and to give it a charge to actually start tackling some of these questions and how to frame these questions for the school and how to engage students in regards to their communications about the issues that daunt them, the challenges that they see within the School of Architecture and the university as well. So you'll see, much like the surveys and much like the graphic, the analog data that we wanted from students, we had several opportunities like this, including these town halls, but also these efforts here where we said, just viscerally tell us how you feel. Just give us a sense of what you feel is an obstruction or not in regards to your sense of community, your sense of engagement of these diverse issues, et cetera, et cetera. And so the code committee over the last several years has been looking at various agendas in that regard as to how do we move forward with in terms of the school and the school's pedagogy, curriculum, ambitions. And other folks as well have taken their charge from either their own planning efforts within their disciplines or as part of the school's strategic plan. But it's been, I think, inconsistent as being fairly flattering in that regard. There's been progress, there's been some pluses, definitely, some wins, but by and large, we're at the point now, this slide of the platform issue that I co-edited with Nicole Wiedemann was a good opportunity for me to also, it forced me to step back and put in writing some of the thoughts that I had regarding race and diversity and relative to my existence. And it's a precursor to this talk in a way. It covers some of the same topics in a much more abbreviated fashion. But again, the school has been struggling with this for a number of years now. And so at least the struggle had started, but in terms of actionable items, in terms of where you can what progress has trickled down to all of our community, students, staff, faculty, administration, throughout, alumni, that's been part of the, the quest for discernible change, even more profound change. And there's a definite sense of urgency that has come about, largely due to the incidents that have happened in the world around us in the last year or so in that regard, and justifiably so. This was a really good opportunity to actually put, a pen down and start really thinking through some of the issues that I've been struggling with myself personally. And it also probably was the first time I realized this is not going to go away. There's always going to be a struggle, and it's always going to be something that you're challenged by. And I think that's going to be true for all of us as a community as we look forward to the challenges we have with us, that we've had with us for a while, and that we'll have with us in perpetuity. And so it's a common theme in regards to this constant reflection, right? And I hope that it never goes away. I particularly take joy in when I catch myself and say, "Oh, I hadn't thought about it this way. I haven't thought about this particular situation in this way." And I find it refreshing that I catch myself because for whatever reason, there's also sometimes an assumption that if you are a marginalized group, or if you're a person of color, if you're a person that represents a certain definition of diversity, that you get a free pass in any conversations about, like, you've got it figured out. So therefore it's about how do you fix this problem for us? And it's like, no, the problem is, and we'll talk a little bit more about that because what I want to flesh out a little bit is the idea of, like, whose problem is it to solve in that regard. And in some of the conversations I've had with fellow colleagues and students, there's an assumption that I'm coming from a body of knowledge and experience that I have the answers, therefore I get a pass in the struggle, and that's not true at all. It's reflective of where I am to understand that I don't know it all, I don't get it all. I need to sort of figure it out, and I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm still struggling like we all are. So this sort of signifies sort of like now where we are now and where we have been in the summer, in the spring, late spring, and the issues that are out there that, like, it seems every day goes, not every day goes by and something is hitting the news about someone, right, losing their life, someone being murdered, someone being oppressed, and to be honest, I think we all recognize this has always been there. I think this is partially attributable to the fact that people are now more on point in regards to documenting incidents. They had the means to document more instantaneously. There's more social media opportunities to display issues and to share struggles. I think I hate to put it this way, but there's more of an appetite for it in a certain sense, whether that's the news media, whomever, but it's the reality that these issues have always been there, and they've been there in a number of different ways historically. You pick a generation, pick a decade, and you will see that this has always been there, but being called, the injustices being called out more consistently now than they ever have been is a significant difference. It's something that bears acknowledgement. And the reason I mention that is because the personal impact of that calling out, and partially also because of, you're surrounded by uncertainty in every direction, particularly when you're talking about your personal life, your health, your COVID, those issues. And it sort of focuses more, it brings that to more of a bearing, I suspect, in regards to how this impacts us. So, as much as I've been impacted by racism here and there, and much as I've shielded myself from that reality, I have not feared like I feared this summer, and I, to some degree, is still lingering. Where at some point this summer, I said, I don't feel comfortable walking 3 blocks to the store that I've spent the last 6 months walking to without hesitation. But now I feel that something could happen to me, and I've never felt that before. I felt a profound sense that I was somehow protected, and my identity shielded me to some extent, and that profoundly changed this summer. And that's something that's a major milestone for me. It seems, and I wouldn't say it seems it's minor, but it is definitely not minor, but it's something that was easy to ignore for quite a bit, that sense of vulnerability. I think my identity was one that had assimilated to a certain degree in the struggle, assimilated to the context of Austin, feeling that I was an educated Black man who was in a professional career track, was in an academic career track. After that, was a respected colleague. That somehow that insulated me from the world around me in these issues. That now I do not feel that I'm insulated at all. I feel quite vulnerable in that regard. And it's something that it gives me reason to step back and go, this should have meaning to me, and it has meaning beyond sort of like when you see responses to these injustices, the plethora of statements that are being issued, some significant initiatives as well, but also the idea of like people who are saying, what can we do legitimately in regards to countering these issues of diversity, exclusion, inequities in the world, and inequities in social justice and things of that nature. But there's also things like, well, yeah, having an expose or an exhibition about this person of color, or these people of color, and this community of color, things of that nature, saying let's buy Black, let's do this, let's be supportive. All of that has some relevance, but on the other hand, it has a tinge of superficiality at times. This article here that I'm quoting speaks to that sort of sense of like, what are museums doing, and particularly in this case, museums. How are museums in Austin reacting to Black Lives Matter? But what does that mean in regards to, are they really engaging the community? Right? Are they really understanding? Are they really, how far are they willing to go? And I think going back to Liz Ogbu's talk, when she says, what are you willing to risk? That's something that I'm sort of challenging myself with. And I think as a school, we're challenging ourselves, and we should be challenging ourselves regarding what are we willing to risk. This interview just happened to come on NPR in the last few days, and it coincided with me developing this talk. And I thought this is actually a good mention to bring up, because this writer is talking about the same thing I am in regards to, and he's not talking about why didn't we riot in terms of burning down the town and things of that nature. He's saying, why did I not object more during the course of my existence when these things as a Black man were coming up? Why didn't I actually do this more overtly? Why did I not sort of step up in a certain sense in that regard? Why did I not feel that? Why did I react in this way versus that way as a possibility? What does it feel to be to have my identity in the world around me, and as I see the injustices move forward? So circling back to the school and circling back to the ambition of the school and the challenge in front of me and others, we were previously, a number of years ago, featured as a diversity champion as part of Metropolis and then some other newsprint. I think there's a number of people, including faculty, the UTSO community at large, alumni, who would be stunned to know that this was actually put in writing at some point. They would actually say, when we talk about the legacy of John Chase, and we're talking about sort of some of the initiatives we had recently, but there's clearly needs to be much more in terms of advancement of this needle and moving the needle forward. And what we're trying to do now, and again, I'm challenging myself as part of this assemblage of what can I do? And I think that taking it to heart about what is it that I'm willing to risk in that regard, and what is it that I'm willing to commit to? And that's a challenge that is mirrored in the challenge that we put forth recently to our coordinating committee at the School of Architecture. We're asking each and every one of them who represents a width and breadth of leadership, including student leadership at the school, to say, what is it that you're willing to risk? What is it you're willing to commit to as an actionable item? As many statements as we've made, as many statements as I've made, and which is one of the reasons why I put my statement up, which is the same text that you saw at the very beginning of this talk. This statement that is on my student SOE Voices faculty page speaks to my thoughts regarding diversity and equity in those issues. As a committee of diversity and equity, we have a statement of support for the students that came forth this summer and said, these are the things that we think need correcting and addressing as a school. And when you look at that list, they mirror the list from other students over the last several years. There's a repetitiveness to that, which tells us there's a lot to be addressed. As a concluding comment, this is the challenge that we're issuing within the hierarchy of the school leadership, which I think will also translate down to each and every member of the school UTSOA community. with the agency I hold as fill in the blank, this school year, and I would say even beyond, what tangible action am I willing to commit to? What is it that I'm willing to risk to create a more equitable environment? And that's the question that's on the table for myself. This talk is not asking for answers. It's giving me the opportunity to basically tell you that question lies in front of me and it lies in front of other key members of the school leadership. And as we try to move forward, that's the beginning of the conversation regarding how do we get this figured out? How do we work to make this more of an equitable community for all of us? And I think that's probably my last slide. I probably did horribly with time, but usually I go way too fast. And thank you for the opportunity to share this.
Thank you. You did great with time. We've still got about 15 minutes. If there are questions, please enter them in the chat or feel free to raise your hand.
Charlton, I sort of like, I was sort of tasked with the official kind of respondent role, and like I know we had a long chat yesterday, so like I'm out of the gate early with all the questions that I have. I think.
And by the way, you're probably the most opposite of me.
I think that's why this makes perfect sense, right? Maybe, I don't know. What I found striking, and thanks first of all for a sort of like tremendously sort of personal talk, and I think that takes quite a bit of conviction also to sort of to do that rather than to sort of talk about the safe realm of sort of like form or something. But one thing that struck me was really you sort of had this image of like Charlton wearing different hats, and you kind of like talked about that a little bit. And I think really sort of like the two hats that I think this talk was almost evenly divided between was the sort of private Charlton, the idea of your biography that in some ways was something that you have some influence over, but not everything. And then the second hat was the official Charlton. So Charlton as a member of the code committee, and those two roles seem actually interesting and connected, but they also seem very opposite of each other in many ways, right? Like I think the question for me is like in some ways like do you find it like I have three, I don't really know how to say this yet, but can or can't you consolidate those two roles? Do they feed into each other? Or are there reasons why you would want to play the institutional role and not the private role sometimes, or the other way around, not the private role and the institutional role? Because it seems to me that is really, I think, one of the things that, as you said, like I'm sort of almost the opposite like of you in many ways there, but I think that would make, I was on that committee might make my role very different from yours, and I feel like there's a lot of extra pressure, let's say, on you, or like I'm just curious how you sort of consolidate or don't consolidate those two.
Right, that's a really good question, because I think that it also circles back to a conversation I had with other faculty, and I think even Dean Addington, when we were really when things were sort of reaching a peak in regards to being aware of all the publicity, but the Black Lives Matter movement, but not just the movement, but just the atrocities that were being happening like almost on a daily basis, where people being assaulted, murdered, things of that nature, and then trying to figure out how the school would or should respond, and and what was the status of our efforts. I mean, I think it was one of those things where you kind of go like, what is the status of our efforts to date? And they're justifiably should be criticized in that regard because of the lack of significant progress, or the progress that has been either slow in coming or can be more aggressive, but should be more consistent. There's a number of criticisms that were leveled, and you're sort of looking at that, and I said, right now, I've confessed I feel that it's not my problem to solve. And there are times when I felt that that general sense was, oh yeah, naturally it'd be your problem to solve. Who would be better at solving this? And second guessing an agenda of myself, but also just of the school. Like, why am I on this committee versus am I supposed to be the standard bearer? But I think people of color have this sort of, they're put quite often in this bind that you're referring to. Like I am being, a person of color could say, I'm being overwhelmed by this desire for others to have for me to be a part of every conversation and to be a part of every discussion that has to do with race or gender or whatever, and inequities and things of that nature. And I think what I have found is that I benefit from having the personal side push back on the institutional side in a way, and I don't really see that changing, because I think exactly what I'm doing right now is saying the personal side and the personal understanding of my identity has been submerged in a lot of ways as a defensive mechanism, as a way of saying, this is how I get my head around me living in Austin, me being part of a contextual animal that is Austin, and the how race is dealt with in the city of Austin. I tell this somewhat amusing story. Maybe it's just amusing to me, but and some people understand this, and a lot of people, you go like, oh, I had no idea this was the case. But I said, when I'm walking or riding or driving or whatever, and I see a person of color, generally speaking, and it seems to be more male for some reason than female, but I see someone of color. It could be someone in the back of a garbage truck. It could be someone delivering. It could be someone just on a motorcycle. It could be whatever. But there's like an acknowledgement. There's like a head nod. There's this head nod thing that happens, right? And there's this acknowledgement of people of color that, in particular, African Americans, of each other in this city. But it also happens, and I know it happens in East Texas as well to some extent, and others. And I think without understanding why that happens, it just naturally happens. And then I think you start kind of dissecting, and it has to do with sort of sense of like, you're not alone. There's someone like me here. There's someone who I can say, I don't know you, but I'm acknowledging you because, we're outnumbered, right? And the reason why this is an interesting and somewhat amusing story is that I was so used to that and I was in Chicago for a convention or something, and I see some brothers on the train, and I'm like, what's up? And they're looking at me like, I don't know you. Like what is that about? I'm supposed to know you? And I was like, oh, right, different context here, different situation. We're not outnumbered. Okay, we're cool, we're good. And but that whole sort of like, saying, well, how do I define my existence here as personally versus how do I professionally define it academically? It was a two-headed monster, and I think that there's some benefit to actually one pushing back on the other. One, my personal side being comfortable now holding my professional side accountable is kind of what this conversation is a bit about, is fully now coming out and saying, yeah, my personal side is saying, as part of my understanding of my identity, is pushing back on my professional side and saying, what are you doing? How do you see yourself? And how do you transplant that, how you see yourself, into this other context? And I think that has some benefit. But I will also say that that's me. And I think that it behooves everyone to figure out what works for them and understanding their context, their identity, their response as they look at issues of race. Really quickly, what happens in East Texas, and when I go back, every time I go back, I see more people, the things that you used to not see in terms of races intermingling, having conversations, being friends, being a community that didn't exist in the same way when I was growing up there. And over the years, it gets that sort of overt racism gets in a lot of ways eradicated generationally. Kids today, they just are not used to. They don't understand why would I not have a friendship with someone of color, because they don't really necessarily get that concept, where it was pretty standard practice back in the day. So you see those improvements. What's interesting about being in Austin is that, again, it's like when I moved to Hyde Park a year ago, on the one hand, you have people who are like really happy to see me in the neighborhood because it's sort of like Obama came back, right? And they're like, a little slice of this, I get to talk to someone black, I get to wave to someone of color, in my neighborhood, and I feel good about that. And I'm like, I'm really happy that you're happy that I'm here getting some coffee. I'm happy for you, right? But I really don't really have a need to hang out and to help you, you know, with your Trump strife that you're dealing with, and you're lamenting the loss of Obama, whatever. But in the same street that's happening, I had someone say to me, not to me directly, but it was across the street. They were directing the comment towards me, but in a glancing blow, where they were questioning why I was in this neighborhood, and they were saying it as a statement to everyone who was in earshot, to say, don't they know they don't belong here? You know, and I was like, so there you go. It just takes that to snap you back into reality in that regard. And so that is a very personal thing that, and I'm not sharing it for drama. I'm just saying that it's just one more layer of a personal engagement that I take with me, that I apply to my professional understanding of why this is such a critical sort of come to Jesus moment in a certain sense, you know, for all of us. But I think that we all have to deal with it in our own ways, and we have to sort of figure out, what does this mean to me, and what are my priorities? And that's what we're sort of posing to the student and faculty leadership and administrative leadership of the school, is to say, in your own sort of way of looking at the world, what are the challenges that you're willing to accept? What are the risks you're willing to take?
We have another question from Tara Dudley.
Hey, Tara.
Hey, Charlton. Hey, everyone. I didn't have a question per se, except maybe about those Mickey Mouse ears, but I'm going to leave that alone. I just wanted to say thank you. And after you're fielding the first question, or, you know, comments and thoughts from Martin, just, you know, to give you that nod. And, you know, I see you, and I appreciate this talk and this conversation today, because as you might imagine, I've had some very similar experiences in being from Louisiana, Cajun country, and then, you know, just in my personal and professional life and those various hats. And I just appreciate your candor today, and your very personal take on today's lunch talk. So that's all. Just thanks.
Well, I appreciate it. Once the floodgates opened, it became a little easier, but it's getting to that initial hump of planning this for a while, but then saying, okay, are you in? Are you fully in? As you might imagine, it is very personal. So thank you.
Do we have any other questions, comments from the audience? We are at about 1 o'clock, so.
Let me quickly, I actually owe an explanation about the slide imagery. And Elgin was there for final reviews, and I think this is Mike McCall's studio from a year or so ago. But at one point we looked around and I said, this has got to be the first time we've had this critical mass of Black reviewers coalescing in one review. We have four people of color here sitting on a review. I said, this is probably unprecedented. And I turned to Elton and I said, this is clearly e-news worthy if we only had a camera to document this. And maybe it's happened, but the fact that I could confidently say, I bet this is probably the first time we've had 4 people of color sitting on a review, the final review, I feel pretty good about my guess in that regard. So I thought, when I was asked, Leora, when you asked for a slide, and I was thinking about what am I going to touch upon, I sort of thought about this image, and I was like, yeah, I remember that, because it was sort of like a really good fellowship meeting in that regard. It was a really good experience, but we just need more of it in a certain sense. I guess my goal would be that at some point we won't have to talk about it anymore. Maybe that's probably a altogether too idealistic goal, but it's a goal.
Anyone else before we wrap up for the day? If not, Charlton, thank you. I also extremely appreciated the personal take, and I think it was really good for all of us to hear. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for the invite. Appreciate it.
I hope everybody has a great afternoon and a great weekend. Thank you. Bye.